Local governments are removing monuments and statues of Confederate figures as calls grow for an end to racial and social inequality. The Confederate Soldiers and Sailors Monument in Richmond, Virginia was taken down last week as the former home of the Confederacy reckons with its past, and Virginia isn't alone in reconciling its history with slavery. An analysis by CBS This Morning earlier this year showed states across the U.S. vary widely in how they teach America's history of slavery in schools. CBS News contributor Ibram X. Kendi spoke about this issue.
Kendi also took a look at this textbook, Texas History, which is adopted by the state to teach middle school social studies. It covers topics including slavery and the Civil War.
This is a picture, and the caption says, "Some U.S. settlers brought slaves to Texas to help work the fields and do chores." And, you know, I don't think we should describe slave labor as chores.
A few pages later, Kendi pointed out this image.
The caption for this picture says, "What characteristics of slave life does this image show?" Does this depict slavery?
If we were going to have a single picture that depicted slavery, it should be a picture that demonstrates terror and violence.
And Dr. Kendi joins us now. It's good to see you again. So, Dr. Kendi, education is largely treated as a state and localized matter instead of a national one. As you know, different states use different textbooks from a number of different publishers. And I have been approached by so many people over the last couple of months asking me about things that I thought were sort of common knowledge. In other words, I thought that this stuff had been taught in schools, but I had somebody, just to give you an example, recently say to me, you know, until I read this very powerful essay by in the New York Times that talked about the idea, the notion of 40 acres and a mule, I didn't know that that was a thing. I didn't know that African Americans, once they were liberated, were offered 40 acres and a mule. And it just made me think to myself, I wonder how people are receiving this information, and why isn't this information being taught at schools? So is that one of the reasons why this may not be standardized across the United States?
Yes, I mean, you know, how we teach history is unfortunately a deeply politicized affair. But I think that states should have the ability to determine how their own state history is taught, just as cities and localities should as well. But we should simultaneously have a national sort of standard in the way in which we're telling the story of America's past, or I should say the stories of America's past, because I think young people in Vermont or Georgia or North Dakota and California should all be learning a similar national history, but right now they are not.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. I remember getting into an argument with a co-anchor of mine that I worked at someplace else. I'm Canadian, just so you know. And the argument was over the War of 1812. And I remember we had completely different understandings of who won the War of 1812. It was the first time that it occurred to me that textbooks could be just outright wrong about how they teach history. In Texas, they changed the way that they have been teaching about slavery, essentially saying that, you know, it was mostly about, or the Civil War was mostly about slavery, but still also indicating that, you know, a portion of it was about states' rights. If you could sort of issue a standard message that kids would be taught across the country, what would be the message about the Civil War, for example?
Well, that the Confederate States of America launched a war because they believed, as Vice President Alexander Stephens said in a speech in 1862, that we're building a new nation that's founded on the great truth that the Negro is inferior to the white man and slavery is subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. I'm quoting directly the Vice President of the Confederate States of America in 1862 talking about what this new political body was based on. It was based on the desire to maintain slavery and racism and certainly white supremacy. And this is an unfortunate truth, but it's a truth nonetheless that I think every American child should learn.
You know, Dr. Kendi, one of the other issues, and I think Anne-Marie and I have spoken about this, is the idea that what we learn about our history, and that history includes slavery, shapes our worldview. I want you to maybe perhaps share your thoughts on that. And it struck me, I had a conversation with a friend who said, you know, if you're at a dinner party and you happen to be one or two of the only people of color, Black American, in that dinner party with, you know, white Americans, and somebody is holding forth a conversation on, for example, the Louisiana Purchase, or the Alamo, or the writings of Robert Frost or Mark Twain, everyone will have a point of view and has some exposure to that history or to that culture. But if you mention 40 Acres and a Mule, or if you mention the poetry of Langston Hughes or the writings of James Baldwin, people generally don't have a lot of information or have never been exposed to that. And so I wonder if that is a part of the symptom that we see when we don't get that education early on, or we're not exposed to it here in this country as children in school and in high school.
I think so. And I think when it comes to the writing of our curriculums, when it comes to deciding on who we consider to be part of the canon of classic texts that every child in our school district, that every child in our nation should read, these are choices that we need to make with tremendous care, because largely for many Americans, they may not systematically teach themselves about literature or even history once they leave high school, or once they leave middle school or college. And so, you know, we should be providing that basic foundation so that when we go to that dinner party, we could all have conversations about Mark Twain and Zora Neale Hurston. And I think we would be all better off. And let me just also add that, for instance, we currently have this growing racial wealth gap. And if you do not know the history of racist policies that have sort of taken away or depressed the ability for Black people to grow wealth, then you're going to just assume that Black people have less wealth because of something that they've done wrong, as opposed to the way in which they have been wronged.
You know, Vlad brought up this whole movement about removing symbols of the Confederacy, but you point out that we also have to be honest about our historical heroes. I think Hamilton sort of got caught up in that most recently, as a lot of people are starting to watch Stream Hamilton. They're seeing it. And, you know, there was a conversation about how honest are we being about whether or not Alexander Hamilton was an ally to African Americans or not. Speaking honestly about even those that we celebrate in this country has an impact on our ability to accept our own biases, doesn't it?
It really does. And it's interesting because for some Americans, you cannot even critique an Alexander Hamilton or Thomas Jefferson or an Abraham Lincoln or George Washington, because for them, if you even critique these people, these founding fathers, many of them, then you're anti-American. So can you critique your father? Can you critique your mother? Can you critique your uncle? If you critique them, if you point out the things that they have done wrong, the way in which they've harmed you or other people, does that mean you don't love them? Does that mean you are anti your family? No, to me, those who have the capacity to critique, and to me, critique in a way is a form of love of country. You know, I'm going to point out all of the different ways in which people may have wronged this country, just as I'll point out the way in which they've righted the country, because I want to turn that page on that ugly past. And there's no way we can turn that page if we're not even sure that if we don't even see that page to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, speaking of the founding fathers, I had it happened to me in real life. I was doing a story where I was interviewing the two sixth grandsons of Thomas Jefferson, one who was white and one who was black. And we were at Monticello, and there were a group of tourists coming through Monticello visiting the slave cabins, and one of them asked me what the cameras were for, and I explained what I was doing, and I'll never forget, one of the gentlemen said to me, I never knew that Thomas Jefferson had children you know, with one of his slaves, and he was shocked and he was surprised, but he was like, this is incredible that I'm meeting two of these descendants of Thomas Jefferson, and he thought it was a great honor. But it again struck me that so few of us have exposure to the kind of history of who we are as a country. And so, Ibram, this is a good opportunity to talk about your books. How to Be an Anti-Racist and Stamped from the Beginning, which have now recently surged in popularity. They are now in the top 5 of the New York Times bestseller list. Congratulations. I wonder if this national appetite, so that there are some people who may be ignorant of the history, but are clearly grasping for something to allow them to expand their knowledge and to have a better understanding of our history and where we are at this point in this country. So does this national appetite, what does it tell you?
Well, I think what readers are telling me, people who've read my books and other books by people who have really chronicled the history or even the current presence of racism, is that in many ways they feel duped. They feel as if they were not taught something that they should have known about Thomas Jefferson, that they should have known about the Confederacy, that they should have known about the Civil War, that they should have known about the Civil Rights era. And they're really struggling with how they could be 45 years old or 35 or 25 years old and simply not know America's past. You know, but all the while they thought that they knew. And so I think people, as they're awakening, right, as they're really beginning to see what they did not know, are starting to realize, okay, what else didn't I know? What else do I need to learn? And then I think they're also having these larger questions or conversations that we're having, which is, how do we ensure that every child, you know, learns the truth about America's past in all of its beauty and in all of its ugliness? Because I don't want my child to be like me.
You know, we should point out that your book, Stamped Racism, Anti-Racism, and You, is like, so there's one version for adults, but then there's like a remix version for kids. It's all really, really important stuff, because if we don't know the roots of a plant, we don't know, you know, how it flourished and developed into what it is today. I would love to have you back on to talk about just this exact moment in time and why do you think things are the same or different. So I'm like putting it out there, right? Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you for having me.